In 1987, Square designer Hironobu Sakaguchi devoted himself to a swan song. Before leaving the game industry to go back to college and pursue a different career, he was going to complete one last game, a work unlike anything he had created before. This work became Final Fantasy. Unpredictably, the game became a smash hit in Japan and prevented Square from having to declare bankruptcy. Afterward, the company was at something of a crossroads regarding how to proceed with the series. Many could have reasonably assumed that the company would just make a sequel nearly identical to the original, maybe with a slightly different story, world, and characters, to capitalize upon the success of the original game. After all, most of the development team remained the same. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi directed the second installment as well and created the plot. Yoshitaka Amano again provided the concept art for the characters, and series legend Nobuo Uematsu composed the music. By the appearances of the development team, there would be a huge amount of continuity in the second game in the series, right? Well, not really. In fact, Square resisted the urge to simply make Final Fantasy II a rehash of the original game. From outside appearances, the game does look similar, and a few gameplay features were carried over to the second offering, but overall, Final Fantasy II is a standalone game that broke boundaries and explored new frontiers. It utilized different gameplay mechanics to give a fresh experience to gamers. Final Fantasy II was completed and published in 1988, just 1 year after the original game was released. The game was critically acclaimed in Japan, but various difficulties prevented it from being published in North America. More than a decade after the game was originally released, it finally came to North American shores on several newer platforms, including the PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, and PlayStation Portable. Because the remakes changed little from the original game outside of a significant graphical overhaul and some anti-annoyance changes, I will use a lot of the footage from the PSP version for this video. Unlike the original Final Fantasy, the classes of the characters cannot be chosen at the start of the game. Instead, your party consists of characters that have predefined backgrounds and don't have any particular class. In addition, the game takes place in a whole different world, with a completely unrelated story as compared to the original. The game centers upon a group of adventurers, Firion, Maria, Guy, and Leon. However, at the very beginning of the game, Leon goes missing, and the fourth slot is filled by several guest characters such as Joseph and Min Wu. Perhaps the most controversial change in Final Fantasy II as compared to the original game surrounds the advancement system. In the original Final Fantasy, characters gained experience points in battle, and progressed by obtaining a certain number of experience points per level, thereby increasing their stats and overall power with each uptick. To the surprise of many, this system was completely thrown out the window in Final Fantasy II. Here, each character has individual stats that can be leveled up in proportion to how often abilities tied to those stats are utilized in battle, such as strength. Sometimes this system has been called the activity-based progression system. Under this framework, a character's strength has a bigger chance of an increase the more the attack command is used. In the same way, a hit point boost is more likely to be gained for a character that ends a battle with less hit points than he began it, and intelligence is more likely to increase if black magic spells were used. In this way, not only do your stats level up from usage, but also magic spells and efficiency with individual weapon types. This produces the need for grinding, and the developers incorporated an extremely high enemy encounter rate, apparently to help the player in this regard. Final Fantasy II also does away with limited magic charges for each tier, and instead utilizes a magic point system for the first time. This change was intended to balance the power of magic with physical attacks and allow for the usage of additional spells. Another notable change utilized in Final Fantasy II as compared to the original game was the keyword system. Borrowing from some PC games that had existed at the time, the player is able to record and recite several words heard throughout the story text. These words could be stored and repeated in the future, which allowed the player to progress through several parts of the story and open secret passageways. The idea was unique, but it also had the potential to lead the player astray, to wander aimlessly, approaching each NPC and scrolling through a list of keywords until the story would progress. The story of Final Fantasy II is definitely a vast improvement over the original game. This title is packed with a lot more character details and storyline elements than the first. I also thought the game's guest characters were a very nice touch because they added a lot of intrigue to the story and kept the game from being too monotonous. Also, Final Fantasy II is not afraid to kill characters off, and yes, that means characters in the plural. In this way, Final Fantasy II seemed a lot more dark than the original game and definitely more dramatic. Of all the characteristics of Final Fantasy II, I think the story is actually the high point. I wouldn't say the protagonists are very well defined, but the overarching story is, much more so than the first title. In the original game, you could wander through the story for hours without ever encountering storyline details, but that doesn't seem to be the case in Final Fantasy II. Here, you are constantly encountering new friends, chasing enemies, and even infiltrating the Palamecian Empire. Final Fantasy II features the series' first use of the Chocobo, the running, bird-like creature that allows players to travel long distances without being harmed by enemies. Suffice it to say, the Chocobo has become infamous in the world of Final Fantasy, and has become something of a mascot for the series. Also, the character Cid, who often reappears in Final Fantasy games in different forms, also makes his debut here as well. In yet another series first, Final Fantasy II is the first game in which a Dragoon appears. The game's antagonist, the Emperor of Palamecia, is also well suited to the game. Since Garland from the original game had almost no backstory, the Emperor in Final Fantasy II provided a stark contrast, as you have several interactions with him throughout the course of the game, and his deeds frame much of the storyline. In this way, the Emperor was really the first archetypal villain in the Final Fantasy universe. The music in Final Fantasy II is astounding, especially for the game's era. Nobuo Uematsu built upon the catchy tunes he created for the first title with new ones in this game. Unfortunately, the game's soundtrack had less songs than the original game, 29 in total. Although the first Final Fantasy game featured some memorable favorites such as Matoya's Cave, I think the soundtrack of Final Fantasy II is a bit stronger. Among my favorite songs are the Final Fantasy II main theme, the Rebel Army, and the Battle with the Emperor. The famous Chocobo theme makes its debut in this game, and it's been remixed and reused countless times throughout the remainder of the series, and has become a staple of Final Fantasy itself. Uematsu's trademark use of melody makes the songs in Final Fantasy II incredibly catchy. They truly stick in your head. The game definitely has one of my top 5 favorite soundtracks for an NES game, and the music is certainly a high point. Now, here come my critiques. The enemy encounter rate is too high, and it hinders optimal balance between the gameplay and story. The cumbersome, ineffective system, where you can actually miss an enemy with an attack, is still in the NES version, though thankfully that annoyance was removed out of subsequent versions of the game. I think this was the most irritating aspect of the original game by far. The story is great, but the main characters don't have that many characteristics or backstory that differentiate them from each other. The temporary guest characters, however, do bring these qualities though. The stat, magic, and weapon level up system was an interesting idea with promise, but it could have been executed a little bit better. Bugs that allow you to attack your own team to level up should have been ironed out before the game was even released. And receiving ultimate spells at the end of the game at level 0 basically assures that they will never be as powerful as intended. The full game is pretty short, but that's to be expected from an NES title. All in all, Final Fantasy II is a great RPG that paved the way for many other games in the genre, and ventured into new frontiers for the series. I consider the story and music to be the most exceptional elements, and believe that the game excels in these two areas. The gameplay lags behind these facets, but the new progression system was definitely gutsy. Even though each change from the original game didn't quite work out to the full extent, I have to admit that the new ideas were bold. Sakaguchi and Square should be complimented for taking the game in a slightly new direction, especially when the natural impulse would be to recreate the original game. And that will do it for my Final Fantasy II retrospective and review. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos.